Django Rest Framework is Django's most powerful tool designed for building REST APIs. Today we'll be covering most of what you need to know so you can get on track faster. We'll be building a simple API and in the meanwhile covering serializers, DRF class-based views, DRF authentication and permissions, and JSON Web Token-based authentication, otherwise known as JWT authentication. We'll be covering all these and then calling to our API with ThunderClient to test it out. Once you get a hold of all this knowledge and all these things, you'll be able to build your own APIs freely and with ease, because Django makes it really easy for you to do so. The source code will be down in the description, you'll be able to access it. So with that, let's get to setting up our project. To begin our project, I've opened up an empty folder. We'll be creating our virtual environment and our Django project over here. For the sake of this video, I'll assume that you know some basic Python and some basic Django, because all of this is going to be building on that. If not, you can check out our Django crash course, which takes you through the basics from an API standpoint. First thing that I'm going to do is open a new terminal, and I'll say python -m venv as of virtual environment, and I'll call my virtual environment. Once I run this command, you'll see that a folder gets created on the left hand side, and we'll be working in this virtual environment so that we don't install packages globally. Once this is created, I will say /env/scripts/activate, run that, and we'll be in our virtual environment, and I'll say pip install Django. Once you're done with that, I will run Django admin start project, and I will be calling my project finance tracker because that's the type of project we'll be building. Make sure to put an underscore here and run this command. With that, the project is created. I can cd into the finance tracker and python manage.py start app, and I will call this certain app our API. This should have set up our basic project and boilerplate. The first thing that I'll do is move on to our URLs in the base template and add another path to hook up our app. For this, you have to include the include statement, import it, and then call the path, and I put nothing over there because that's the default that I'd like to work with, include api.urls. First of all, this won't work. We have to go to our settings, and at installed apps down below, I will register our API app. Then what we also need to do is create a urls.py over here on the left hand side in the API folder. And I will create a first view that we'll be using for our home API. It's going to be rather simple. It's going to be a simple function-based view. All it's going to say is home of the API. From django.http, you have to import the HTTP response for this. Now I can hook it up in our URLs. In here, we have to make some imports. I import the home API from the views and the path from Django. And I create my URL patterns over here. The URL patterns is going to contain this path only. Now I'll run the development server and see what happens. Python manage.py run server. And you should be able to see home of the API once you open up localhost 8000. Next, we'll create our modules. This is just the basic setup of Django, so you don't have to worry about it. We are setting it up together so we can work on Django Rest Framework later together. Our module is going to be relatively simple. It's going to be a class transaction deriving from the modules.module. It's going to have a transaction types array of tuples. The left hand side is how it's going to actually appear in the database. On the right hand side is how it's going to appear in the admin panel. It will have an amount field. This amount field will be a decimal field with some max digits. It will have some other fields like the transaction type, which is a model.car field, and it will have a date and a description as well. These are very simple. And I will also put a formatter string over here, so it's formatted more nicely in the admin panel. Other than that, this is going to be our model. Now we have to register it and make the migrations. So we'll head onto our admin.py. Here, all I'm going to do is admin.site.register, and I do have to import from .modules transaction, and we are going to register the transaction over here. Now bring up your terminal, stop the development server, python manage.py, make migrations, and then python manage.py migrate to our database, but we won't be having a super user yet, so I'll call Python manage.py create super user test@gmail.com, give some dummy password. I will give some very simple one, it will also complain. There we go, now we can clear this. And I can run the development server once again, and we should be able to see this in our admin panel. So if you come to /admin, you log in, then you will be able to add some new data over here. I will be adding 2 data, nothing too crazy. It will be $1,000 income with the date being today. Let's add another transaction and it will be a $200 expense like the bills, and save it as well. This should set up our database so we can now install Django Rest Framework. Now for the installation of Django Rest Framework, stop your development server, clear the console and paste this command: pip install Django Rest Framework. While it's working and it will finish in time, we have to go to our settings.py. I'll close this terminal. And in the settings.py, below our API, I will register the REST_framework. This is how you enable REST framework to be used. We will be coming back here because there are multiple things that we need to set up. But before that, I will close all the files and we'll talk a little bit about serializers. Serializers are needed because there is the Python-based object, our models, which in forms of API cannot be given down to, for example, front-end React applications because they cannot process the data. For that, we have to convert it into JSON type data, and that's what serializers are for, and they make it extremely simple to do so. In our API folder, I will have to create a new Python file called serializers.py. In here, I have to import from REST framework because now it's in our project. Import the serializers, and while we're at it, from .models import the transaction. We have to make a class-based serializer over here. So class transaction serializer is what I call it. You will have to make a separate serializer for every model. So if you were to have multiple models, you'd create multiple serializers because this will validate your data first of all, and then throw it back in a proper format. It has to inherit from the serializers.model serializer. Inside that, you have to add the class meta tag, and inside that, you have to define your model. The model will be the transaction. As for the second parameter, you have to define your fields. You could put __all__ in here, or you could define them yourself. These are the fields that I'd like to show in here, and this will be the ID, the amount, the transaction type, date, and the description, just like what we've defined. And basically that's about it for the serializer. For creating a serializer, all of this will come together when we work in the views. But I'd still like to show you some Django Rest Framework specific methods. For example, there is a validate. Since the data in the serializer, when it gets passed in, it has some rules for validation. It has some default rules like from Django, deriving from Django, like the character field, when the integer field cannot be a character or string, but we can define our own rules as well. To define our own rules, we have to create a function over here, def, and it's important that it's the validate function, but not in this format. Validate and underscore and the name of the field that you'd like to validate. For example, I have an amount field over here. So I'd like to validate the amount that was spent in the transaction. It gets the self and the value, and then here comes the validation. If the value, that means the amount that was sent in as the amount basically for the transaction, is less than or equal to 0, then I want to raise an error here because that's not a valid transaction. Raise and then serializers.validation error, and then put your message over here. Amount must be greater than 0. Otherwise, if we get past this check, I can simply return the value. And this way we have our own validation for this amount field. So with this serializer done, let's get back to work on our views because that's where we'll be using the serializers. First of all, I'd like to make some imports. From REST framework.views, I will import the API view. This is a class-based view. This is what each generic view will derive from, which we'll be talking about at the end of the video. This is what we will inherit our views from. It handles a lot of basic functionality, and that's why it's very useful for us. From REST framework.response, I will import the response as well. This response from the REST framework alone handles the response of JSON data, the HTML, all the other stuff. So this one is also very, very important for us and very, very useful. From REST framework, I'll import the status. This will be important for when we are throwing some errors. And from .models, I'll import the transaction. Also, while we're importing the transaction, from .serializers, import the transaction serializer. Now we can start working. First of all, let's create a class-based view. Transaction list is what I'll call it. This will be simply responsible for listing out all the data that's available. It will derive from the API view. As a usual class-based view goes, we can define the get method, for example, as of the get response being handled, and the post separately as well. It will receive the self and the request. And inside that, I have to do some basic logic. This is the bare bones way, I would say, the more flexible one, but it's a little more code than what we'll be looking at the end of the video. First of all, I will get the transactions from the transaction.objects.all. I want to get all of them. I have to define a serializer over here, and that serializer is going to be our transaction serializer. Then put parentheses, and I will pass in the transactions as the data that's going to get validated and serialized. I will set many to be true because we are passing in many data. And then in here, I will simply return in the response that we've imported. This is Django Rest Framework's response, the serializer.data. This alone will validate our data, and if it's not valid, for example, the amount that we've written in our serializer, then it will get thrown back. In the meanwhile, let's also handle the post, and we'll then have a look at how this looks in the UI, because the UI now completely changed. Def post, and it will receive the self and the request. And this time we will also define the serializer, but this time the data will be the request.data as the one that was sent, because this will be for creating new transactions. If the serializer.is valid, this will check the validation checks all over the fields. If they are valid, then we have to save the data in our serializer with the serializer.save. And if the data is valid, I return a response. And inside that response, there will be the serializer.data given. And the status will be the status, which we've imported, .http 201 created, because we've successfully created a new transaction. Otherwise, if this is not true, then we return a response, and this response is going to be a little different. It's going to use the serializer.errors, and its status is going to be the HTTP 400 bad request. This way, our validations all go in place, and there will be absolutely nothing to worry about. Now pull up the terminal, or actually not pull up the terminal, let's go back to our URLs because we have to hook this up. Let's give another pass out over here. It's going to be the transactions, and make sure to put a slash at the end. The view it's going to be using is, we have to import it. Over here it will be the transaction list. Since it's a class-based view, we'll be having to use the transaction list.sview. And while we're at it, let's give it a simple name, and we should be good to go this way. Now we can run the development server. And if I visit /transactions over here, you'll be able to see that the transaction list appeared, and we have a whole new UI. Actually, I'm logged in with the admin user right now on the top right. You can see it in the navbar. Since it's a list that gets all the data, you'll be able to see the two transactions that I've made listed over here in a JSON format, because the serializer actually put it into a JSON format. And I can also send some data over here. For example, if I was to copy this and put the content over here, its ID is going to be 3, and let's say a $300 transaction. It will be an expense, it will be made today, and it will be for food. Let's pause this. And you'll be able to see that this got created, it changed to post, but if I refresh the transactions, it actually got returned to the database. Over there is the ID 3, amount 300, transaction. So our post request and our GET request is actually working. If you were to try this out, for example, to connect it with the React app, it would be working. You just have to get over some cross-origin resource problems, the usual course problems, but there are still so much that I want to show you. For example, proper authentication, there is a few things in this UI that is broken. So let's move on with those. First of all, come back to our views because I'd like to create one, or actually our URLs first, because I'd like to create a dynamic URL as well. I will paste this in. This will be the transaction detail, that's the name of the view we are going to be using, but we are using a dynamic primary key lookup over here. So let's go to our views and actually create this. It's going to be the class transaction detail that's going to derive from the API view. It's going to have a get method. You pass in the self and the request, but over here also pass in the primary key. And we will start with the try catch block or try except block here in Python. I will try to create the transaction and it will be the transaction.objects.get, where the primary key will be equal to the primary key that was passed in. This way, if we are trying to get that certain transaction, and otherwise, if it fails, that means we are accepting the error, transaction.doesNotExist condition. If it does not exist, then we'll simply return a response with an error. This error is going to be error transaction not found, and the status is going to be HTTP 404 not found. It's rather straightforward over here. We of course have to define our serializer, and this serializer is going to be the transaction serializer. Once again, put parentheses and pass in the transaction as the data that we are going to serialize, and then simply return the response with the already serialized data, which is going to be the serializer.data. That's about it. Now I can move back here, import the transaction detail, and I can save the URLs up as well, and we should be able to get this to work. So if I put transactions/1 in the URLs, I will be able to see the income, but I can also put 3 over there and I will be able to see that. If it's transactions/4, an error of this type gets serialized and put back that the transaction is not found, it does not exist. Now let's get back to our project and have a look at authentication. So to implement authentication into our app, we have to come to our settings first of all. Because in our settings we have in our installed apps the REST framework, but we do not actually have any authentication specific things. The way we are going to do this is implement a REST framework object below our installed apps. Actually you can put it anywhere, but I put it here because then we can see what we are working with. And we have to incorporate the default authentication classes. This is what you'll be finding in the source code when you copy this over, but I will be leaving only session authentication here, or maybe token authentication as well, but not the JWT authentication yet. Session authentication is needed because then Django remembers and doesn't ask you to always log in. These are some very default basic authentication methods. How the token authentication is done is that it stores your token in the database and that token lives on forever, so that when you send it somewhere, they can basically log in with it. They don't even need your username or your password or your email. The token in itself is enough to access whatever you have access to. So that's why it's a very basic one. And we also have to put in some default permission classes. These will be more for the permissions, but since we are using authentication, we will be dealing with permissions as well. The default is authenticated. This is mandatory to be included. The others are optional, although I highly recommend you do those. It will reject anyone who's not authenticated. Or one that I prefer to use is the is authenticated or read only. It will reject anyone that's not authenticated unless they try to access the safe methods, which is for example the get or the options. They will be able to use those. There is the is admin user, allow any, and the default Django permissions. The last three are not really used in my opinion. You'll be able to see because we'll be using these. One other thing I'd like to do is come to the URLs of your main app, the financial tracker. Here I will include something that's very important for us from the UI perspective. This path to the API out/, which includes the REST framework.urls, will enable a login button at the top right when you run your development server and visit one of Django Rest Framework's API. Let's have a look at it. What do I mean by this? Okay, so I ran into a little bit of a problem. It's because we are not yet using class-based views. That was our problem, and I commented out the Django permissions. I just included it to show you I don't use it anyways, so it's not a big deal to exclude it. But since we are not using the built-in generic views yet, we will be having a problem and you'll be running into that. But other than that, if you open up the UI, you'll be able to see that I can actually log out of here. And I can also log in through Django Rest Framework. Now let's get to permissions since we have this little login UI setup. Here below this status, I will import something else from REST framework.permissions. We have to import the built-in permissions like is authenticated and also is authenticated or read-only. As I explained before, is authenticated throws back anyone who's not authenticated. Is authenticated or read-only enables the get function, for example. Here at the transaction list API, I would like to set permissions so that anyone is able to get, but not everyone is able to upload data, post data. For that, I will include these permission classes. This will be an array of permission classes, meaning you can add multiple of those. And I will put in here the is authenticated or read-only. We'll be using a custom permission for the other one down below, so don't worry about that. So now if I come back to our app and refresh, I still have this post form where I can post some data, but if I log out, suddenly that form is no longer there. I have to log in to be able to send the data. And if someone was to try to access your API this way, they wouldn't be able to unless they are registered users. Now talking about custom permissions, I will come into our API folder and create a new file. This will be the permissions.py. Here from REST framework, we have to import the base permission. REST framework.permissions actually, base permission. This is like the API view and all the other stuff that it will derive from. And I will create an is owner or admin permission. It will derive from the base permission, and what you see here in triple quotes is actually a tooltip. When you hover over it, you'll be able to see more information or this information printed out specifically. And we have to override the built-in function here. Has object permission is what we are going to override. It will give us this return super.has object permission, which is the default. And instead of this, what I'm going to return is request.user.isStaff. So if it's either a staff or object.owner, meaning the one guy who created it, is equal to the request.user. What this is going to say is that you won't be able to access other people's stuff unless you are actually an admin and the owner of the app, or if you are the one who created it. This is a little bit of privacy thing. We have to import it, so in our views below the permissions, from .permissions, I will import the isOwner or admin permission. And in here, I will set the permission classes to be the isOwner or admin class. Now, of course, I do get an error here, and this is to be expected because I have not actually included users or this owner field to be generated. So that's not something I will be wasting much time on. I just wanted to show you that you are actually able to define custom permissions. So I will be just commenting this out. This is something you have to handle on your own if you want something like this. Just comment this out because I still want to show you JWT authentication and then the generic views. That's about it for permissions. To install JWT authentication, bring up your terminal, stop your development server and paste in pip install Django Rest Framework simple JWT. This is what we'll be using. Then you can run your development server once again. I will hide the console, and we have to hook this up in our settings, because in our settings we have actually quite a few things we can manipulate over here. First of all, in the default authentication classes, I will include the JWT authentication, and then down below we have to override, because let me explain the way JWT works. You get each user, when they log in, they get two tokens. One is going to be an access token, and one is going to be a refresh token. They all perish after a set amount of time, and the access tokens is used to access the APIs that you are referring to. This usually expires faster than the refresh tokens, and the refresh token is there so that whenever you try to access an API like this, you refresh your current token, you get back a new access token, and that way you won't have to always log in, at least not until the refresh token expires, but it's not forever like the basic token authentication. This way it's more secure. So I paste this over here. We import a time delta from datetime, and then the simple JWT object will be set to the access token lifetime, which will be 5 minutes, and the refresh token lifetime, which will be 7 days. Auth header types will be the bearer. This is like the authorization, except here instead of authorization you put bearer and then your access code or your refresh code, depending on what you're doing. One other thing to note about this refreshing is that we can come to our URLs. This is going to be our API's URLs. Let me close all of these up and find it. And we have to append our URL patterns to more routes. These are built in with Django Rest Framework. First of all, from restframework.simplegwt.views, I have to import the token obtain pair and the token refresh view. At /path API/token, I will be able to obtain a pair of these tokens. This is basically our login. And on the other path, I will be able to send my current refresh token and get a new access token. These are the two that we'll be working with. And if you have a look in our app and visit these APIs, so instead of /transactions, I will say /API/token. You will be greeted with this. You can send your username and your password. And if you set /API/token/refresh, you'll be able to see you can send your actual data here, post it, and you get a new pair of tokens. Or actually not a new pair of tokens, only a new access token. Let's try this out. I try to post my current credentials, and here is the refresh and the access token that I'm able to get from here. Now let's try to refresh with this refresh token being sent. So I will copy this, go to the /refresh, and then paste this in. Actually, I have to remove the refresh and the other stuff from there. Only the token needs to be sent. I post this data and I get back a new access token. That's how this generally works. One last thing in the meanwhile I'll show you is the hyperlink models. If you come to your serializers and insert a URL tag over here, this is kind of an entry point you can use. You'll be able to see a much cleaner way of navigating your API. If I come to /transactions, this is an expected error. I wanted to show you this. You get a hyperlinked identity field. We have to add context request to each of our serializers. So let's do that. And then you'll see why this is also a very neat way that Django Rest Framework provides you with. This is not actually a problem if you're using generic views, which we'll be doing right now after this is updated. So whenever you have a serializer, you just put a comma over here and context equals request. Serializer over here as well, put it over here, and at the end right there, put it there. Once you are done with that, go back to your app, refresh, and you'll be able to see a little URL appearing with your current URL, with the current localhost app. And if you click it, you'll be greeted or actually navigated to that URL, but we don't have the credentials to log in for this now. So let's get to generic views, and then we'll try this out from a separate API from ThunderClient. Over here, I will comment both of these APIs out, or these views. And what I'll be doing is redefining them. But before that, we have to import two important things. And actually there are multiple of these. From REST framework.generics These are the generics that are very powerful. Import the list create API view and the retrieve destroy API view. There is also some other types of these, but these are the two we'll be looking at. If you look up the documentation, you'll be able to see all of those. Like for example, simple create API view, destroy API view, generic, all of these. What these two will say is that it will list the data out, and you can also create, meaning send post request, which is exactly what we are doing here at the lists. And there is also the retrieve destroy API view, which permits a get method and a delete method whenever you are viewing this. The way this is going to go is you simply create your class just like before. I'll add a tooltip over here. And then you have to define a query set. In the query set, you get which type of data should be listed out, which will be the transaction.objects.all. You could also filter or get some data over here. You have to define your serializer class, which is going to be the transaction serializer. And you also have to put the permission classes, which is going to be the is authenticated or read only. With these 3 lines of code, basically we are doing exactly what we did here in about 15 lines of code. Let's do the other one as well. I won't be having the permission classes over here, but this basically does exactly the same. The only difference is that it's not getting one object, it's again getting more objects, and this is overridable if you want it to. But it may seem like it's getting all of them. Actually, it will only get the dynamic URLs one. So if we come back to our app and try these out, which these are just about 6 lines of code, and do exactly the same that 30 of them did. If I go to /transactions, it works exactly the same. Actually, it may be a little neater over here because no, it's not raw data like it was here, but you can actually submit the income or the expense, the amount. And if you go to one of these hyperlinked URLs, I'm logged in, there is a delete button over here appearing, meaning I can delete this, or I am simply able to view this data. And we've just written this in 6 lines of code, so it's super that Django has this, or actually Django Rest Framework provides this feature. With this, we are almost done with the crash course. All I want to show you is how this works from an external API. So we'll head on to ThunderClient, which is over here, which is an extension you can download to VS Code. And I have 2 posts prepared over here, which are probably expired by now and not even for this project. So the first, I will zoom out a little. We are going to send to the API/token our username and our password. If I send this, I will get back the refresh token and the access token. Now, if I want to refresh my token, I will have to copy this refresh over, and I have one that's pointing to the /refresh. I will put it over here instead of this refresh token. I send it, and now I have a new access token available. Let's see if I can access our API with this access token. I will copy this access token out and I create a new request. This is going to come to the transactions/1. So I messed up this. Actually, this has to be bearer, and then comes this token. And this has to be authorization, just like we did before when I was doing the calendar app. And now it's saying okay, so I don't have to put it in strings, I just have to put bearer, then the token in the authorization, and I get back the data that was needed to be get back with this little access token. But if I was to wait 5 minutes, then this access token would expire and I would have to get a new one. Basically, this is how you would set it up at the front end as well. Now with this, we are done with our crash course. We went over the basics of Django Rest Framework so you can get on track and actually dive even deeper and learn more about it, use it. I encourage you to build some project with it. And if you found value in this video and would like to see more, please consider giving us a like, maybe even subscribe. Other than that, I hope to see you in the next one. Happy coding and God bless.